Good morning, everyone. Today we have a class on selection process. Previously, we had a class on the recruitment and the areas related to the recruitment. Both recruitment and selection are complementary, and this particular function, rather sub-function, comes under the procurement function. It has been emphasized that once you have done your job analysis properly, that is, made your job description and specification accurately, and have worked out on human resource planning, then you are in a position to go for recruitment and selection. We have also learned that recruitment is reaching out to a large pool of candidates and stimulating them and also encouraging them to apply for the jobs. Since it involves a large number of candidates, rather prospective candidates, so it is viewed as a positive function. But selection involves rejections. Selection involves elimination. Just as a square peg does not fit into a round hole, so a bad selection or inappropriate selection can lead to disastrous consequences. Therefore, it is very important that to meet the strategic goals and the objectives of the organization, choosing the right candidates for the right job is of utmost necessity. Selection is in fact weeding out the most unsuitable candidates, and selecting only the suitable ones. Therefore, it brings about a clear distinction between the suitables and unsuitables. It is important that we must note that selection procedure involves a series of steps, and each of these steps can lead to rejection of the candidates. These are generally followed in succession. Therefore, there is a possibility that in each of these stages or steps, there is a likelihood of rejection of the candidates. Our objective is also that one only. We need to eliminate unsuitable candidates in order to have the most suitable candidates for our organization. You know, selection succeeds recruitment. Other way you can say that recruitment precedes selection, isn't it? And also, the selection involves, if you go through the selection procedure, we can find that there are series of steps followed in succession, right from the preliminary interview to the employment stage. And here in this graph, you can find in the x-axis, it is shown as the rejection, and in the y-axis, the candidates. Right from here, which is the preliminary interview, thereafter the next step is application form, filling in the application form, then comes the selection test, selection interview, physical examination, reference check, final approval, and finally the employment. And here it is also clearly shown that in each of these stages there is likelihood of rejection of the candidates. So the arrow mark downward depicts that, the rejection, right? Only the suitable ones can go to the next step or stage. Understand? In the preliminary interview, the person who succeeds, who are found suitable one, can go to the next and fill up their application form with certain attributes mentioned therein. The data is elicited. The big firms, they design their own application forms. Small firms may not have their application forms tailor-made. Hence, they might ask the candidate to specify certain important information such as certain demographic data, personal information, physical information, educational qualifications, experiences gained, then other attributes like, hobbies, languages known, the courses undergone, extra courses undergone. So these are few attributes which are actually tailor-made, very specific to the organization. And large organizations, they supply the application form, and those information must be provided by the candidate. The idea is to elicit the crucial information which would be necessary for conducting the selection test. It is also to know about the candidates in brief, and questions can be directed accordingly to verify the candidature. It is also to build up a rapport with the candidate, giving information about the organization, about the task from the side of the interviewer, and also eliciting information from the interviewee. If you find that in the application form there will be a huge rejection, ample rejection can take place at this stage, and hence the remaining ones are elevated to the next higher stage, rather they can go for selection tests. You can find that there are several selection tests that may be conducted in order to select the right candidate for the organization. The tests can be classified as aptitude test, achievement test, personality test, and interest tests, broadly classified into 4 categories: aptitude test, achievement test, personality test, and interest tests. In the aptitude test, a candidate's aptitude in solving problems, in accomplishing the task, in exhibiting the required behavior towards doing the job, these are tested. And this can be further classified as intelligence test, that you can see here, mechanical test and psychomotor test. So in the intelligent tests, which are the things or attributes are being tested for the candidates? It is about the fluency, it is about the spatial visualization, it is about the testing the intelligent quotient of the applicant, and there can be certain cutoffs decided. It is perceived that below the cutoff, the person would be in a lesser know-how to accomplish the job rightly. Person who meets the criteria of achieving the cutoff, it is presumed that the candidate would be in a position to accomplish the job effectively. Though all of these tests are not foolproof, neither these tests go for testing the whole of the human resource, yet designing a suitable test can get you the advantage of selecting to a great extent the right candidates for the organization. Then comes the mechanical test. In mechanical test, the ability to do a particular mechanical work is seen. So tests are designed in such a way so as to confirm whether the person's ability to undertake the mechanical tasks is tested. And comes the psychomotor test. From the very name itself, it implies that it is a combination of body and mind movements together, application of body and mind. There has to be a control and coordination between the body-mind movement. So these tests are designed in such a way so that psychomotor ability of the candidate is tested. Right? So here you can say in the aptitude test, intelligent test, mechanical test and psychomotor tests are designed. The broad objective of conducting these tests is to test the aptitude, as well as the performance of the candidate together with the behavior of the candidate in doing the job. So three things are being tested in fact: aptitude, then comes behavior, and then comes performance. Right? Then in the next comes the achievement test. Here in the achievement test, what is tested? In the achievement, the job knowledge is being tested. To what extent a person has the job knowledge in accomplishing a task. In the earlier days, it could be shorthand, it could be typing, it could be the test to see calculation, computation, etc. And in the case of work sample test, a sample of a work is provided to gauge the performance of the candidate as how successfully, to what extent accurately the person is able to do that, finish that sample. Say for example, the person may be given a piece of work to be typed, something. Understand? Or a letter to be drafted, or something even that can be some piece of mechanical work to be done with the use of machines, right? So this kind of tests can be work sample tests. Then comes the personality test. Personality is the exhibition of the personal traits of an individual. The personality is viewed as a combination of different traits of an individual. It could be self-confidence, it could be emotional control, it could be working in a stressful situation, it can even be testing the decisiveness, correct judgment, assertiveness, interpersonal relations, or even the tests can be directed to gauge person's ability to work in a difficult situation, in a situation of distrust, in a situation where the judgments are to be given, in a situation wherein a person may be required to prioritize the task and accomplish the job. So all these things can come under the purview of judging the personality of the candidate. The tests can be objectively created so as to elicit as accurate information as possible. It could also be some kind of projective tests, like showing an ambiguous picture, a vague ambiguous picture, and is asked to state the conception or the perception of the candidate based on that ambiguous or vague pictures. Or it could even be a situation test. How do you react in a given situation? A situation is given, a situation is narrated, then you may be asked to act in a given situation or give your reactions in a situation. The test can also be on the interests of the candidate, like the likes and dislikes of the candidate, the strengths and weaknesses of the candidate, the hobbies that the candidate nurtures. These tests are actually conducted in order to find out how suitable the candidate is based upon the job of the organization. Therefore, there cannot be one single test for all organizations. Tests are to be made specific so as to cater the need of the organizational objectives, of the need of the job of the organization. Therefore, it varies from organization to organization. Then the next thing in the order comes selection interviews. There are various kinds of interviews that will be conducted in order to select the suitable candidate for the organization. And the types of interviews are, here you can see, informal interview, formal interview, structured interview, unstructured interview, depth interview, group interview, stress interview, and panel interview. Again, each of these interviews meet specific objectives and are chosen carefully so as to select the suitable candidate for the job. So again I am repeating: informal interview, formal interview, structured interview, unstructured interview, depth interview, group interview, stress interview, and panel interview. Now let us know about each of these interviews, right? Starting with the informal interview. Informal interview can take place at an informal setup. It can take place at any venue. There is not a clear venue demarcated or designated for this purpose. Even an employer can take a person to the manager's home. An interview can take place informally. The interview can take place at any other public places, like at the airport, and one-to-one interaction takes place between this interviewer and the interviewee. And if the interviewer finds the person is suitable for the job and also for the organization, then a person is taken on employment. Since this kind of interview takes place in informal setup, so it is called informal interview. Then the next one is the formal interview. In the case of formal interview, the interview takes place in a formal setup. There has to be a venue, a place designated or demarcated for this purpose, where there will be the interviewer and the interviewee. All interviews is to be called. Suitable arrangements for light, ventilation, etc. Sitting arrangements must be there. So appropriate environment must be created in order to conduct this kind of interviews. Therefore, it can be said that since this type of interviews take place in formal setup, so the interview can be called as formal interview. Then the next one is called structured interview. The other name of the structured interview is patterned interview. The other name of the structured interview is also patterned. Why patterned? Because here the list of questions according to the attributes needed to accomplish the job are found out from the candidate. So a questionnaire is prepared where there will be a number of questions which are made according to the requirements of the job. So interview takes place in a formal setup and such a pattern is followed. An interviewer or the number of interviewers may be there, they would be judging on all those attributes which are mentioned as questions and register their observation or allocate the marks as the case may be and can be objectively tested. Therefore, this kind of interviews are called patterned interviews or structured interviews. In unstructured kind of interviews, such a thing does not happen. What happens instead is the candidate is allowed to speak his or her mind freely. The candidate is given a chance to speak freely. And whenever a candidate stops, the interviewer does prodding. And in the process, the important information is elicited from the candidate. The candidate is devoid of any prejudice, any fear, any apprehension in this kind of interview and can speak his or her mind. Such kind of interviews are called unstructured interviews. Unstructured interviews. And these interviews are again named as non-directed interviews. The other name of unstructured interview is non-directed interview. Clear? The next in the order is the depth interview. Depth interviews are conducted to gauge the proficiency of a candidate in the special area of interest. For example, if you need to hire an economist for your organization, a depth interview can be conducted so as to gauge to what extent the in-depth knowledge the candidate possesses. So these kind of interviews are conducted to gauge, to assess the person's in-depth knowledge in certain areas, certain special area of interest. Then the next in the order is called group interviews. Here the candidates are allowed to sit in a group and the questions are directed towards them. It is in fact to assess, to judge the behavior of the candidate in a group, how a person behaves in a group, more like in a group discussion. And then comes the stress interview. A person is deliberately put in a stressful situation. How effectively the person handles the stress in a given situation is assessed, is judged. Such kind of interviews are called stress interviews. And the last one here is the panel interview. Panel interview is also called as board interview. Quite often we come across with a term which is called board interview board, right? Here is this type of interview which is called panel interview or board interview. Here actually the interviewers are many, more than one. There are experts in this. So the collective wisdom and knowledge is directed towards the candidate. The questions can be in a sequence or sometimes maybe randomly put. The person has to act accordingly and answer the question. So, panel interviews are those kind of interviews wherein the panel members, they sit across the table. In front of them there will be the interviewee. Several questions can be directed at a time or one by each of these panel members, and the person is tested how effectively a person responds to these different questions is tested through the panel interview. So the interview types are formal, informal, structured or patterned, unstructured or non-directed, depth interview, group interview, stress interview, and panel or board interview. Is it clear? Then comes interview errors. You know, it is not that always the interviewees are to be tested, are to be assessed, but at the same time it is also important that to test the interviewees, to select the most suitable candidates, how best the interviewer is prepared, how best the interviewer is trained, whether the interviewer is trained enough to assess the suitability of the candidates or not. And quite often we land off in committing mistakes or errors in conducting the interview. Therefore, it is imperative that we must be free from these limitations. The limitations are actually the interview errors, which can be conducted on the part of the interviewer. The interview errors could be personal bias. The interview errors could be halo effect. Interview error could even be constant error, leniency, projection, and stereotyping. So these are actually the limitations of on the part of the interviewer. The limitations are personal bias, halo effect, constant error, leniency, projection, stereotyping. Now let us know about each of these errors, right? So what do you understand by personal bias? Personal bias means personal favor. It is something associated with favoritism. But that can happen instantaneously. Looking at a candidate's hairstyle, fluency of speech, or maybe a pleasing personality, a kind of bias can take place in the mind of the interviewer. Thereby, the other efficient candidates' opportunities may be lost. The judgment of selection, the decision can go in favor of that candidate. Therefore, the manager, the person who is conducting the interview, must be very careful so as not to exercise any personal bias. Then comes the next one as halo effect. A single and very prominent characteristic can overpower the other characteristics of the person who is being interviewed, rather the interviewee here in this case. A person comes from, say, village, a remote village. If a person thinks that, the interviewer thinks that that candidate may not be having good hygienic sense, good sense of hygiene, that is not correct. Then comes constant error. What do you understand by constant error? Sometimes the previous candidate has acted brilliantly, answered brilliantly. Thereby, the interviewer might think that the next candidate is not suitable one. So there could be an error committed in this way. Such a thing is called constant error, wherein the interview of previous person unduly influences the next one or next in the order. Then comes leniency, tendency to assign high scores to everyone. Leniency, tendency to assign high scores. Thereby, on the part of the interviewer, there is a fault. That person is not able to judge, or maybe sometimes deliberately not acting in that way so as to assign the right marks to the candidate. So, whenever any interviewer assigns high scores to each of these candidates, then it can be said that the person has a limitation, an error, that is called leniency. Then comes projection. Then comes projection. Here, the interviewer expects the same knowledge, the same skills, the same value in the candidates. Whenever any interviewer tries to see the same value, same knowledge in the interviewee, that means the person is having an error that is called projection error. That means the interviewer's personality is being projected and is sought after from the interviewee. Such an error is called projection. And interviewee's association with a particular community or a particular personality trait gives rise to the error of stereotyping. Right? So, in a nutshell, it can be said that personal biases are those wherein the interviewer is biased, maybe on certain traits of the interviewee, such as maybe on certain characteristics or of the interviewee, fluency in speech, maybe certain particular hairstyle, maybe certain likes and dislikes. In the case of halo effect, a single and very prominent characteristics overpowers the other traits of the individual. Then in the case of constant error, interview of previous candidate influences the interview of other candidates in the order. Leniency, tendency of the interviewer to assign high scores. Projection, wherein the interviewer would like to see his or her own knowledge, skills, values, abilities in the candidate. In the case of stereotyping, wherein the interviewer finds some association between a particular person and a particular community or trait, etc., then such an error is called stereotyping. You all would be holding responsible positions in future, maybe either as managers or opening up your own ventures in due course of time, wherein invariably you would be involving in selecting the people. Please keep it in mind that you are devoid of, rather free from, all such interview errors. Only then you would be in a position to select the right candidate for your organization. Previously, I said that you may have enough other resources like capital, like land, building, like machines, but if you do not have appropriate human resources for your organization, if you are not able to select the right candidate for your organization, then you cannot attain the objectives of the organization by optimally utilizing other resources. If you are to your organizations are to follow the growth trajectory, to sustain in the long run, to make profits, to excel, to grow, then it is the necessity that we select right candidates for our organization. Today, in the digitalized world, many or all of these processes are done even graduate through the digital platforms, right from the job posting, application tracking, then time and again making a contact with the person, conducting tests and interviews. Interviews are actually face-to-face interaction between at least two people, two persons. Such a thing is done nowadays through the digital platforms, as you are already aware of and maybe undergoing through this process. And even thereafter, the selection and finally, the selection and finally onboarding. You must have a sound onboarding system in place, and that can also be created digitally. So in today's class, we have discussed on the concept and definition, selection procedure, selection tests, selection interviews, steps in the interview process, interview errors and limitations, guidelines for effecting interviewing. Once again, let me tell you the steps. These steps are followed in succession right from the preliminary interview till up to the employment stage. Each of the stages again has rejections, and the objective of the selection is to have rejection, is to have elimination, so as to have only the most suitable candidates for your organization. Therefore, the selection can be divided into two parts. Suitable can divide the candidates into two parts, suitables and the unsuitables. So, in the preliminary interview, generally conducted by a junior executive, and then at this stage the maximum of the rejections take place. It is also to be carefully noted that while conducting this interview, due care and caution to be exercised so as not to be harsh with the candidate. The candidate may not be suitable for this job, but due dignity is to be accorded to the candidate. Candidate must have a good image about the organization. And then comes the application form. Nowadays, widespread application of curriculum vitae. You are doing so and working on certain attributes. Those are actually reflected in the application form. Big organizations even now, they have their own application form designed. And those application forms are specific to the organization so as to elicit the required information for the job suitable to the organization. And then after receiving information through the application forms, there could be different types of tests conducted. After the test is conducted, a particular or maybe combination of one or more tests can be done in order to select the right candidate. Here also rejection takes place in each of these places. And then the physical examination, generally by an appointed or designated doctor by the company, or the company can advise the candidate as from where to have the medical examination done. This has also its own purpose. This is to see to what extent the candidate is actually medically fit, and if certain ailments or deficiencies are there, then it would be helpful for the organization in due course of time to apply on the workmen compensation or employees compensation, right, accordingly. And it would also help to assign on certain jobs wherein the person can be deputed even with the physical deformities. Physically challenged people also can be deputed for certain tasks. So this serves multiple objectives. Then comes the reference check. Generally, a candidate is asked to give 2 or 3 references. The references could be a person who is well known, or can be the even from the educational institution, could be a professor or an HOD for that matter. For an experienced person, maybe the previous employer. And the in the reference check, the referee is actually approached by the concerned organization to get some information on the candidate, where it is said that it is maintained, the confidentiality is maintained in this case. However, it has certain demerits also, that in most of the cases the reference actually the referee, they give the remarks which are very good and what is called supporting the candidates. And then the final approval takes place. Actually, the HR departments is to conduct this, go through this entire process, and finally the approval lies in the hands of either the departmental head, concerned departmental head, or certain executives or the top management. They actually signs on the appointment letter. The appointment letter has the position, the rank, the pay scales or the grades, and the terms of the terms and conditions of the employment. These are the things are generally mentioned in the appointment letter. And finally, the onboarding of the employee takes place. That is called the employment. Means after receiving the communication, the person actually joins the organization. So that is why it is called the employment. So you can see here, right from the preliminary interview till up to this employment stage, there involves actually 8 different stages. In fact, these 8 different stages may not be applicable for all the organizations. Organizations can have their own selection procedure which are made very specific to the organization, which are tailor-made. It is according to the need of the organization. However, this is a conventional one, right? And then we have seen different kind of tests. Here you can see in the test can be broadly classified as aptitude test, achievement test, personality test, and interest test. And again we have seen that aptitude test could be intelligence test, mechanical test, psychomotor test. Psychomotor, right? Mental as well as physical dexterity is seen. And then achievement test, here is the job knowledge test and work sample test. Here in the personality test, objective test, projective test, and situation test. And finally, the interest test also can be conducted. Then, the last but not the least, is the guidelines for effective interviewing. What guidelines we must adhere to in order to have effective interviewing? So there has to be a definite time schedule prefixed already, right? Definite time schedule must be strictly adhered to. In all interview, there has to be a personal approach exercised. You have to make the person comfortable, and all interviews must be conducted privately. Understand? A sense of privacy, an atmosphere of privacy must be there for conducting the interview. So that is what is called element of privacy. And then, if certain questionnaire is to be prepared, then there has to be a checklist provided. If the checklist is provided, it would be rather easy to conduct the interview in a very structured way. Then, competent person, experienced and trained in conducting interviews must be placed in the interview board. If that is not there, then what happens? There would be every likelihood of committing interview errors. So as to avoid interview errors, the persons, those who are conducting the interview, rather interviewers, must be competent and well trained. Proper interview method or technique must be adopted. Then specific guidelines to both the interviewee and the interviewer to be provided. Specific guidelines regarding the interview to be provided. All the information must be recorded. All information must be recorded properly. Okay? So, minimal of the error should be there, or if possible there should be no error itself. Okay, and finally the most important thing is interview must end with a positive note. Whether the person is selected or not, the person can carry a good image of the organization while leaving the venue of the interview. That must be kept in mind. So these are few guidelines as how best the interview can be conducted, right? I hope each of these areas are covered in the class, right from concept and definitions to selection procedure, to selection tests, selection interviews, steps in the interview process, interview errors or limitations, and finally for guidelines for effective interviewing. Okay? So we have seen that the true essence of human resource management lies in the fact that we do acquisition, utilization, development, and retention of the human resources. In the next class, we shall see in detail about how human resources could be developed. So the next topic would be HRD, Human Resource Development.